further ado, I'd like to first introduce Steve O'Keefe.
Well, Len, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and thank you to everybody in the audience. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Talking about tryptophan, I've been described as worse things. So hopefully we can keep you awake. And I was trying to make a call earlier today, so I think this room is a fairly safe venue. You're not going to be interrupted by a cell phone ring because it's impossible to get out. So I have you trapped at this stage. So my name is Steve O'Keefe. I'm the Executive Director of the Telework Exchange. And the Telework Exchange is a public-private partnership focused on unlocking gridlock in the telework area, enabling telework, leveling obstacles. And specifically, we do focus heavily in the public sector. We also work in the private sector. So we met with the good folks at the Federal Managers Association about a year ago and started the dialogue with the Federal Managers Association, because whoever you speak to in the federal telework debate, too many people point back to the federal managers as the biggest obstacle to telework. Too many people have demonized the federal manager as the stopping point, the obstacle to telework. And what we wanted to do was get a sense for, well, let's provide a chair at the table for federal managers. Let's understand how federal managers feel about telework. Because it didn't seem quite fair that everybody was pointing at federal managers but not allowing managers to engage in the dialogue. So just to run through a couple of statistics, according to the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, 19% of eligible federal employees are teleworking. So there's tremendous focus, if you look at people like Congressman Frank Wolf, Congressman Tom Davis, on this notion of trying to drive eligibility, to try and identify which federal employees are eligible. The idea being the more people that are eligible, the more people will telework. But if we look at OPM's numbers, what we see is that only 19% of eligible federal employees are actually teleworking. We then look at other statistics, and what we see is that based on a CDW study, 79% of federal employees who could telework would telework. So given the option, the overwhelming majority of federal employees, given the opportunity to telework, would do so. And then we compare and contrast, we juxtapose these two numbers. 19% of eligible employees are actually teleworking, but the overwhelming majority of federal employees would telework if given the option. And we have to scratch our heads and say, well, what about this other 81% of eligible employees? How can we focus on giving them more information about telework, make them aware of the fact that they're eligible to telework, and help them approach their managers about how to telework? And this is managers as well as frontline employees. So I'll quote one last statistic here before we get into the main substance of the discussion today. But this is a new study the Telework Exchange is going to come out with. And unfortunately, what we find is that 67% of federal agency telework coordinators believe that management resistance is the #1 barrier to telework adoption. So what we see is that only a very small percentage of eligible employees are teleworking. The vast majority of federal employees are interested in teleworking, and telework coordinators point the finger at managers. Lauren. So maybe we could start off, just to make sure we're all on the same page, telework with a definition. Telework is a work arrangement in which an employee regularly performs officially assigned duties at home or other work site geographically convenient to the residence of the employee. And there are a number of different classes of telework. There's regular telework, which occurs 1 or more days per week. This is an OPM definition. Situational telework, this is when things go wrong, and we need to set up a situation where employees can work from home. Telework, to be clear, is not working from home at night or on the weekends. That's unpaid overtime. Okay. So in terms of the landscape, some of the statutes, October 2000, public law passed which required that federal agencies allow eligible employees to telework. And the notion was there will be 20% of eligible employees allowed to telework year on year. And so my math is not the greatest, but it would seem that 100% of all federal employees, eligible federal employees, will be teleworking by now. But that has not turned out to be the case. And there are a series of legislative actions. Frank Wolf has put in place holdbacks and appropriations. He did sit over the appropriations committees for justice, commerce, state, and so on. In addition to the legislative requirements, there have also been a series of recent events which have driven the requirement for telework to the forefront. Things like increasing gas prices, concerns about instability in the Middle East, concern over continuity of operations either for man-made issues or natural issues, concerns about pandemic planning, BRAC, which Jack will speak to, base realignment and closure, focus on recruitment and retention, significant quantities of the federal workforce, as you know. I'll go to my notes here. According to a 2006 Federal Human Capital Survey, 6 out of 10 people in the federal workforce, including 90% of senior executives, are eligible to retire in the next 10 years. I'm sure you're very familiar with those issues. So telework is being driven by a series of factors, including recruitment and retention. And then there are a series of benefits for all involved agencies, employees, and the entire region, whether those are business continuity, retention and recruitment and retention, work-life balance, productivity, reducing congestion, environmental impact, and the like. So now to the study that we put together working collaboratively with the Federal Managers Association, underwritten by Tannenberg, and we issued this study January 22nd. So what do we see? This is the first study that went out and spoke to federal managers and asked them how they felt about the telework issue. And I have a 4.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, so I've been reading quite a lot of Dr. Seuss. And what I see here is green eggs and ham. So as we move from left to right, what we see is that managers who do not manage teleworkers are 54% favorable of telework. Managers who do manage teleworkers, they're more favorable, 63%. And managers who are teleworkers themselves, 75% of those managers are in favor of telework, have a favorable attitude towards telework. So green eggs and ham, try it and you may like it. And then we asked a series of questions about telework drivers and telework inhibitors. And what we see is that based on managers' feedback, that work-life balance and recruitment and retention are the priority activities which are driving telework, and that COOP and pandemic planning and real estate savings are less important in terms of driving. But if you look at the agency overall mission requirements, this COOP pandemic planning has been the #1 priority. So there's a mismatch between what the managers see as the focus and what the agency's mission is telling them that they should be focused on. So a greater opportunity, I think, for communication from the agency leadership to the management level. As far as telework inhibitors go, what we see as being hot issues are fear of losing control and productivity. And what we see as not being major issues are lack of funding and security concerns. But when you ask consistently, if you read the articles in the media, the focus is consistently on lack of funding and security concerns. So there's a mismatch between the perception and the reality based on the results of the survey. I think this is a killer slide. Do managers believe their agencies support telework? 47% say no. So if you don't believe that your agency supports telework, how are you supposed to support telework? So I think that's a very interesting. I mean, only 35% of federal managers said that they believe their agency actually supports telework. So when asked what would encourage greater support for telework, #1 from the managers, encourage managers to telework, which is consistent with the green eggs and ham slide. Increased training, the opportunity to share success stories so you can find out how another agency or another department has used telework to overcome obstacles, maintain continuity of operations without compromising productivity or security. And then a shift to performance-based review processes, which has been an interesting hot button for some time in the government. And the focus here is on managing not by walking around, but by outcomes. So understanding if you establish specific objectives for the federal employee, for your staff, then you can manage them not based on looking over their shoulder and finding out whether they're working, but do they actually produce the product they're supposed to be